Why did the British choose not to assassinate? Did you know that some of the most intense conflicts in history were fought not only on battlefields, but also in the quiet corridors of power? Imagine the tension in a London office in the early 20th century, where decisions about life and death were debated over maps and telegrams. The British Empire had enemies who could change the course of wars with a single act. Yet, in many situations, the choice to refrain from assassination was deliberate. Let's float over to a pivotal moment in colonial India. The British faced leaders whose influence over local populations was immense. They had the power to incite rebellion, to disrupt trade, and to ignite resistance movements that could threaten the empire's stability. On paper, removing these figures seemed logical. Yet intelligence officers and governors often hesitated. They understood that an assassination might martyr a leader, and the resulting unrest could spiral far beyond expectations. Every act of violence carried political consequences more intricate than a simple tactical gain. In the early 1900s, a key figure emerged in Indian revolutionary circles. Newspapers referred to him as a dangerous radical. The British debated whether his removal would quell unrest or inflame passions. Reports flowed in from spies, locals, and military officers. Each account emphasized his charisma and ability to unify disparate groups. The officials considered poisoning, ambushes, and secret gunmen. They imagined how each scenario might play out in the streets of Calcutta and Bombay. Ultimately, the decision was made to observe rather than strike. They calculated that eliminating him could create a legend, and legends were far more dangerous than any living person. Let's drift to another royal disaster. This time in the Middle East, the British had influence over several territories, where local leaders were unpredictable and sometimes hostile. Assassination was a tool used sparingly because the ripple effects could touch allies and enemies alike. Imagine a small desert town where news traveled by camel and whispers in the market. One wrong move could ignite months of rebellion. In many cases, British officials chose diplomacy, espionage, and the careful manipulation of rival factions rather than outright removal. They understood that stability often relied more on perception than on elimination. Across Europe, during World War I, intelligence networks debated similar questions. Certain military leaders were considered threats to the balance of power. However, political calculations always dominated military logic. The British knew that if they removed a figurehead prematurely, it might empower a rival who was even less controllable. Assassination could backfire spectacularly. Instead, they invested in propaganda, financial influence, and behind-the-scenes diplomacy. Every decision required a calculation of timing, optics, and the likely response from local populations. Let's float now to a quieter, almost forgotten episode in Africa. British administrators governed vast regions with limited forces. Rebellion was always possible, and leaders who could rally large numbers were seen as potential troublemakers. Yet the choice to assassinate was not automatic. Colonial officers knew that killing a leader in a remote province could inspire resistance in neighboring areas. Each assassination carried the risk of sparking uprisings that might spread across hundreds of miles. Instead, the British often preferred to co-opt, bribe, or negotiate, turning potential enemies into temporary allies while maintaining a facade of control. Even in domestic politics, the shadow of assassination loomed. British intelligence and law enforcement constantly monitored radical groups. They weighed options and considered whether removing certain individuals would stabilize or destabilize society. Each decision was influenced by public perception, international scrutiny, and long-term strategic interests. The logic was simple: a single poorly executed assassination could undermine decades of political work. In many cases, the safest path was restraint and observation, rather than immediate elimination. Let's move across oceans to North America. During the early 20th century, Britain maintained influence over political movements even in distant territories. Leaders who advocated rebellion or independence could have been targeted, yet they were often left untouched. Officials feared that martyrdom could transform minor figures into symbols of resistance. They understood the delicate balance between force and perception, realizing that control sometimes required patience more than violence. Assassination was not merely a tactical decision. It was a gamble with consequences far beyond the immediate moment. As we glide back to India, the complexity deepens. British officials faced multiple revolutionary factions, each with its own motives and supporters. The calculus of assassination was intricate. Killing a leader could unite rival groups against the British, or it could fracture movements in ways that made control easier. Timing, secrecy, and intelligence were crucial. Officials often decided that observation, infiltration, and subtle manipulation were safer and more effective than overt violence. The lesson was clear. In the theater of empire, restraint could be as powerful as the sword. Let's float over to the intricate networks of espionage during World War II. British intelligence officers often found themselves with opportunities to remove key enemy figures. Assassination plans were drafted, debated, and sometimes rehearsed in shadowy rooms filled with maps, coded messages, and anxious officers. Yet more often than not, the plans were abandoned. Strategists understood that a successful assassination could provoke retaliation or destabilize a region in ways that could endanger civilians and allies alike. The British weighed every action against the potential fallout and realized that restraint could be more strategic than sudden violence. Consider a case in occupied France. Resistance movements were gaining momentum, and certain collaborators were prime targets. British operatives knew they could eliminate these individuals, yet each decision carried risks. Killing a local official could spark brutal reprisals from the occupiers, potentially costing hundreds of innocent lives. In many instances, intelligence officers chose to gather information, sabotage infrastructure, and manipulate communications rather than strike directly. They understood that indirect strategies often achieved objectives without creating martyrs or inflaming the population. Let's drift back to India, where the empire faced a growing wave of nationalist movements. Leaders who could inspire millions were tempting targets, yet the British remained cautious. Intelligence reports described crowds chanting slogans in streets, rallies that grew larger with every rumor. Officials understood the psychology of resistance. Removing a single figure could unite hundreds of factions against them, transforming a momentary threat into a historical legend. Instead, subtle measures such as limiting public appearances, spreading disinformation, and co-opting potential allies were preferred. Every move was calculated to maintain influence without provoking irreversible anger. Now let's move to the Middle East during the post-World War I period. The British had expanded their territories, but many leaders were fiercely independent and deeply respected by their people. Assassination seemed tempting when faced with persistent rebellion. Yet officials recognized the diplomatic consequences. Killing a tribal leader could upset neighboring tribes, ruin negotiations with other foreign powers, and compromise trade routes critical to the empire. The British often opted for negotiation, manipulation of rival factions, and careful intelligence monitoring. They understood that an empire built on coercion alone was fragile and prone to collapse. Across Africa, British officials encountered similar dilemmas. In regions with sparse military presence, removing a local figure could create a power vacuum. This vacuum often led to chaos, infighting, or the rise of someone far more challenging to control. In many provinces, administrators employed strategies of influence rather than elimination. They offered privileges to compliant leaders, subtly undermined those resistant to authority, and carefully observed shifting loyalties. The decision to refrain from assassination was rooted not in morality alone but in practical governance. Every life removed carried consequences that could ripple across hundreds of miles and decades. Let's now turn to a lesser-known episode in Ireland during the early 20th century. British officials faced insurgent groups whose tactics ranged from sabotage to assassination of loyalists. Plans to preemptively remove certain leaders were proposed, yet they were rarely executed. Officers understood that an assassination could radicalize local populations, strengthen opposition groups, and damage the empire's reputation internationally. Instead, intelligence networks focused on interception of communications, infiltration of organizations, and strategic arrests when necessary. Control was maintained through observation, subtle disruption, and careful patience. In the corridors of London, debates continued over these ethical and strategic dilemmas. High-ranking officials analyzed reports from colonial governors, spies, and military commanders. Every scenario was dissected. Could the death of a single leader achieve stability or spark a larger rebellion? How would allies perceive the action? How would rival empires respond? These questions shaped decisions in ways that were often invisible to the public eye. Assassination was not the default choice because the cost often outweighed the potential gain. Let's float over to the quiet landscapes of the Pacific colonies. British officials were aware of rising nationalist sentiments and emerging leaders who could unify resistance movements. Some officers argued for direct action, yet historical memory weighed heavily. Assassination in other territories had sometimes led to long-term instability, economic disruption, and diplomatic crises. Observation, infiltration, and indirect manipulation were deemed safer and more effective. Officials recognized that influence was often more durable than fear. Control achieved through subtlety often endured longer than control achieved through bloodshed. Finally, let's drift toward a symbolic understanding of British strategy. Assassination was not simply a tactical choice. It was a political act with consequences reaching far beyond the immediate moment. British officials understood that their empire relied on perception, negotiation, and influence. Removing a figurehead could generate unintended reverberations. They had to balance morality, pragmatism, and strategy in every decision. In many cases, choosing not to assassinate proved wiser than any strike could have been. Let's float over to the quiet corridors of the British Foreign Office during the interwar years. Officials reviewed dossiers on leaders across the globe, assessing threats, influence, and potential consequences. Assassination was discussed but rarely executed. The reasoning was clear. Removing a leader could create chaos that extended far beyond a single province or colony. Every action had to be measured against political stability, international perception, and long-term imperial strategy. The British understood that patience often wielded more power than force. Consider the delicate situation in Egypt. Local rulers had complex loyalties and far-reaching networks of influence. Some advocated independence, while others sought compromise with the British administration. Officers debated the possibility of eliminating prominent leaders, yet they feared the reaction. A single act could inflame a nationalist sentiment, create martyrs, and ignite unrest across the region. Instead, the British relied on diplomacy, selective support, and strategic intelligence gathering. They learned that perception often mattered more than immediate action. A leader kept alive under careful surveillance could be more manageable than a martyr whose death inspired generations. Let's flow back to India one last time, where revolutionary activity continued to challenge British authority. Certain figures were under constant observation. Officials had the means to remove them but chose restraint. They calculated that assassination could unite multiple factions against the empire. By contrast, indirect strategies such as censorship, infiltration, and manipulation of rival groups allowed the British to maintain influence without creating legends of rebellion. Every subtle move, every piece of intelligence, was part of a broader strategy to preserve control while minimizing risk. Now let's move to the Caribbean and African territories during the same period. Colonial governors encountered leaders whose ambitions and popularity could threaten imperial order. Assassination was considered, yet most leaders were left alive. Officers understood that removing a prominent figure could spark revolts, disrupt trade, and weaken alliances. Instead, the British implemented systems of indirect control, offering incentives to compliant leaders, exploiting rivalries, and carefully monitoring opposition. The art of governance was as much about patience and subtlety as it was about military power. Across Europe, in times of political upheaval, the British observed rather than struck. They understood the consequences of creating symbols of resistance. Assassination could provoke retaliation, radicalize movements, and tarnish Britain's reputation on the world stage. Leaders were watched, intelligence networks gathered information, and influence was exerted quietly. The long game was prioritized over immediate gain, because the empire's survival depended on stability and perception more than the elimination of threats. Let's drift to the psychological dimension. British officials recognized that assassination was not only a political act, but a moral and symbolic one. The act of killing a leader carried reverberations that could shape public opinion, inspire literature, and alter cultural memory. Martyrs could transform localized unrest into national or even international movements. By contrast, restraint allowed officials to manage perception, maintain control, and manipulate events without provoking waves of resistance. In many cases, the empire's power depended more on strategy and patience than on force alone. Now let's float over to the lessons of history. By choosing not to assassinate, the British often avoided larger conflicts, reduced uprisings, and maintained fragile alliances. Restraint allowed for the subtle shaping of societies, the co-opting of rival leaders, and the careful preservation of influence. Every decision was a balancing act between immediate tactical advantage and long-term strategic consequence. Assassination was an option, but it was rarely the best one. Finally, let's reflect on the subtle legacy of this restraint. The British approach teaches us that the exercise of power is rarely about immediate action alone. It is about perception, influence, and patience. Leaders observed and monitored could be guided, rival factions manipulated, and public sentiment shaped without a single act of violence. In many ways, the decision not to assassinate was a testament to the intricate understanding of human psychology, political calculation, and the art of empire. The British learned that sometimes inaction could be the most powerful action of all. The story of why the British chose not to assassinate is not one of cowardice or morality alone. It is a story of strategy, foresight, and the understanding that the consequences of a single act could ripple across continents. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by what is done but by what is deliberately left undone. And in the quiet spaces of power, in the shadows of intelligence offices and colonial halls, patience proved to be a tool as sharp as any dagger, as powerful as any army, and as enduring as history itself.